Postmodernism is undoubtedly a rather complex and difficult term to define, but that's because it's dealing with an undefinable or ill-defined condition.
Postmodernism is a state of mind.
Postmodernism is Camembert cheese, that is Camembert and Gorgonzola combined. It's a hybrid cheese. Most people have heard of postmodernism and don't have a very clear idea of what it means. They can be forgiven this confusion because postmodernists don't always know, and even when they think they do, they often find themselves disagreeing. I coined the term postmodernism in architecture in the 70s, and it was picked up in other fields such as philosophy, the arts, literature. And people often disagree on what it means because it means so many different things. But it really refers to the pluralism of our age and the fact that we're dealing for the first time with a kind of multiculturalism within a global setting.
Postmodernism is a notoriously complex term to define, but perhaps it can be most easily understood as a reaction against the architecture of modernism, the dominant ideology of the 20th century.
Modernism really was a recognition of the belief that industrialisation really could make the world a better place. So the key modernist architects, people like Le Corbusier, the Swiss architect who practiced in France in the 20s, 30s and 40s, or Mies van der Rohe, who was German, taught at the Bauhaus and then went to the States, where he built lots of the great post-war skyscrapers in the 50s. These were people who felt that industrial materials and industrial production processes could help them to create better buildings. And the buildings they designed were rather ascetic, rather sparse, very simple, very elegant in a sort of rather basic rationalist way. Modernism did to some degree become a victim of its own success.
Oh no, not again.
By the 50s and 60s, it was the dominant architectural style worldwide. You had local authorities who desperately needed to house hundreds of thousands of people. So suddenly you had people who were in a way copycat modernists. They hadn't developed the ideas, they weren't the great innovators. The buildings they designed were really quite unimaginative.
For Charles Jencks, the death of modernism can be precisely dated. On the 15th of July 1972 in St. Louis, Missouri, the Prit-Igoe housing development was dynamited after years of dereliction and vandalism.
When Prit-Igoe was blown up, it was really the shot heard around the world, and that was because it had won so many awards for being a modern building in the Le Corbusier tradition, houses in the air, machines for living in, and all that. And so it was a much greater failure than other ones. That was it for high-rise living and for mass housing. Kaput.
The recognition that modernism had failed was a liberation for architects. It suddenly allowed them to completely rethink the way buildings could look, whatever their function, and the results revolutionised architecture.
The key freedoms of postmodernist architecture is the freedom to do what you want, which sounds an odd kind of freedom, but within modern architecture you had to do what the building required. You mustn't do a lot of things that were simply, oh, I think I'll decorate that in a certain way, well, I'll do this, and I'll have a bit of fun over there, and I wonder if my client would like a sort of house in the shape of a duck. But if you were a postmodernist, you'd say, hey, I'll have a house in the shape of a duck and one in the shape of a hat, and then I'll have 3 more in the shape of hamburgers. So there's something impulsive and silly and gay and colourful and nutty about postmodern architecture.
This pumping station by John Outram perfectly illustrates how postmodernism opened the door to a whole new vocabulary of colour, wit and imagination.
John Outram is very important as a postmodern architect because he uses colour, and yet as a modernist still, he uses concrete. He translates it into a new kind of architecture, which is actually functional. For instance, in the pediment, he places a fantastic fan above it. Well, now that fan obviously is airing the building. I mean, it's a pumping station with lots of fumes and so on. And so the fan acts not as the goddess in a pediment would do in a classical building, but as a sign of what's going on. So his symbolism has a certain meaning. It's not just gratuitous ornament. It's playful, it's colourful, it's full of wit.
During the 1980s, East London's skyline was dramatically altered by the biggest regeneration programme in Britain's history. Nearly 500 acres of land were colonised by new buildings, the majority of which were in the postmodern style.
Most of the buildings, certainly the early buildings that were built in Docklands, were essentially sort of cheap postmodernism. This was a classic case of very greedy private sector property developers wanting to build quickly, wanting to build cheaply, and wanting very flamboyant, flashy buildings. So we had lots of mirror glass, lots of bright colours, lots of sort of cheap neo-Grecian columns, most of which are now falling to bits.
Postmodernism turns into what's called POMO, kind of kitsch postmodernism. It's rather boring architecture, very reactionary. So you have to look, as always, amid the dross to find the gems. And they're there, but they're surrounded by runaway, Thatcherite, cowboy architecture.
What is proposed seems to me like a monstrous carbuncle on the face of a much loved and elegant friend.
The arguments over the National Gallery extension really were a sort of central firing point for the postmodernist debate in Britain in the 80s. The early, much more adventurous plans for the extension were eventually replaced by Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown's extension. It seemed to be one of those architectural compromises that attempted to please everyone and really delighted no one.
A much more clearly understandable example of postmodernism is Jim Sterling's addition to the Staatsgalerie in Stuttgart. The building is a very good example of double coding because it uses two codes of architecture, two major codes, the classical, and it uses the modern code, that is high-tech architecture, this highly colored steel and reinforced concrete. And it uses them in a very juxtaposed manner.
An architect who takes great pleasure in mixing all kinds of materials incoherently is American Frank Gehry, who first came to notoriety when building his own home in the late 1970s.
I explored industrial materials like corrugated metal and plywood and things like that. Those were the materials that were being used by my neighbors. And I just reconstituted them in a different way that was personal. And it shocked people.
There's no material that's too good or too bad for Frank. He'll use gold, he'll use Cadillac gilt. He's a man who really enjoys and revels in the diversity of the architectural language. You could say he's a funk architect.
The blurring of distinctions between high and low culture, so evident in the work of Frank Gehry and others, owes a huge debt to the American architect Robert Venturi. When he and his wife Denise Scott Brown published their book Learning from Las Vegas in 1972, it caused an outcry because it dared to suggest that the vulgar and garish architecture of Las Vegas was the true inheritor of the American tradition.
The fascination for a city like Las Vegas would be that it is totally low culture. There's nothing noble or high-minded or serious or modern there. It is totally postmodern in that it's a totally frivolous, low culture place, totally about entertainment and pleasing the eye.
Las Vegas is the perfect POMO city. It's a caricature of postmodernism because it takes all the diversity and pluralism and then tarts it up and turns it into a stereotype. The problem is that the day after you wake up with an architectural hangover and you say, oh, for the real thing, I've had enough simulation, I'm going back to reality.
Postmodernism is such a difficult term to define, but at least it can be understood in terms of opposites. As a cultural phenomenon that grew out of the architecture of modernism, it's everything that modernism wasn't, and more.
Modernism is purism.
Industrial, rational,
Restricting.
Postmodernism, witty,
Empty, giddy,
Hybrid.
Pluralism, chaos, and warmth.